It's a pleasure to welcome David, who goes by Bert, I understand, at times, Westbrook, to our workshop.
Confusion starts here and it just goes downhill from here. It's only going to get worse.
David is the Lewis Delgado Professor and co-director of the NYC Program
Sole director.
in Finance and Law at the University of Buffalo, sole director. He writes about the social and intellectual consequences of contemporary political economy, work that crosses a number of disciplines, including law, economics, finance, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, design. And he's spoken around the world, actually, about many of these matters. Often with the sponsorship of the State Department.
In a different era.
In a different era.
I should take that off.
And he's written, by my count, since 2008, some 8 books, including Between Citizen and State, An Introduction to the Corporation, and most recently, Social Thought from the Ruins. So most recently, Social Thought from the Ruins, Quixote's Dinner Party, which he felt we should be read as a play. His blog, which is widely read by corporate theorists, is called Signal. I think it's called Signal.
Intermittent signal.
Intermittent Signal, and it's on Substack. And I've only begun to dip into it, but it's fascinating. And rather than write a paper, as you know, Bert has given us some detailed thoughts in contemplation of another book. And so I'm looking forward with great excitement to today's conversation. I want to make a note to the audience for those who don't regularly attend the workshops. We are going to hear from David for a while, and then after that, hear reactions from Ron Colombo and Daniel Greenwood, who are also teaching in the corporate area of law. And after Bert responds, we'll then open up the floor to conversation. We have begun this year to upload our workshops to YouTube as part of the Hofstra series. So those of you who participate and converse should know that your conversation may end up on YouTube, and fair warning if you don't wish to have that, make that known to us.
I don't think I ever consented to that.
So
Distribution here.
without further ado, let's hear from Bert. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Norman, for inviting me. And thank you, Ron, for hosting me, and Ron and Daniel for commenting. I've known you guys for a while. As Norman said, when he called, he said, well, do you want to give a paper? And it's kind of like, I don't want to write a paper. I'm working kind of hard, but I have these anxieties, and maybe we'll talk about that. I've relatively recently finished a big book that Norman mentioned, Social Thought from the Ruins, which is a sort of polyphonic memoir of conversations between an international group of social scientists, largely with funding from the Swedish Central Bank. And we got together in various places and bitched about the way the university was developing and whether or not we would join again. And that also led to questions of power and the way we were failing to approach it in any serious way. Oddly enough, my university funded this thing, so it's free. You should all read it. The ebook is free. It's not free. It's free to you. It's open access. Cost $12,500, which is what it takes to buy off Routledge for a book of that length. There is no free lunch, as the economist. That's the only true thing the economists say. So you should check that out. Anyway, so I've finished this project, and I'm thinking about what are other possible projects, and do I want to write them? I've written a lot of books, and I'm doing some other interesting things. I spend a lot of time in the mountains. I've spent time in New York. What is the right thing to do if you don't have any professional ambition? And that's a non-obvious question. So one thing that's been on my mind, as most of you guys know from the announcement or whatever, something called social capitalism. So I want to talk about kind of what I might mean by that and sort of why I might have been thinking about this since basically the end of the financial crisis, about which I wrote a book. Some of you may have already seen, I wrote sort of a letter. Ron kept saying, we always distribute something. It's our tradition. And, at my age, who am I to kick against tradition? So I said, well, okay, I should, it's only polite to comply with the tradition. So then I started writing and I got a little, things as usual, got a little out of hand. So I pushed send and you have that. And I'll go through some of that if you haven't read it. But I want to start in a slightly different place, slightly more biographically. And if I were at the top of my game, I would speak completely extant, but I'll probably keep this computer open because I'm going to be diffuse and I'd like to say somewhat on message. So I've got my little teleprompter, as it were, here. So me, part of my family is German, and specifically from Hamburg, which is traditionally a socialist SPD party stronghold, even in the radical decline of the party. So that's very much my mother's family's politics. And sometime in college, I was an extern. Instead of doing a semester in Washington, I did a semester in Bonn, back when the Bundestag was still in Bonn, for a socialist Abgeordnete, a historian named Hartmut Zoll, who wrote a very big, very famous biography of Helmut Schmidt, what the Germans call Zeitgeschichte, sort of history of the present. So anyway, so I've got a lot of background in sort of lefty thought, roughly speaking. At the same time, I was always somewhat resistant to what we might call communism. I'm never a Marxist, right? I never bought the materialism, much less the atheism. I never thought class was that solid of a notion, though I use it a lot in my writing, but in a kind of squishy way. Veblen is more right than Marx, there's an essay on Substack about that, with pictures of very expensive shoes and so-called Veblen goods, right? So it's very hard to take Marx seriously standing in Bergdorf's, which I was. And I teach capitalism in a big way. Different footnote. I've just finished editing a guy named Hyun-Woo Kim, who's a Korean writer. He's got a book out, which I was privileged to be offered the chance to edit. Actually, he's not a native English speaker, called The Great Leader and His Eternal Life. I'm hoping it gets a big publisher. You should definitely read it. I don't think anybody else could have written it. It's a sort of among other things, it's a sort of Dostoevskian novel, but with a Korean voice. And it's in part about the spiritual aspects of communism, both in the Soviet Union and in North Korea. And the conceit is it's 1994, Kim Il-sung dies, Kim Jong-il takes over, so the father of the current leader. And the Koreans ask the folk who take care of Lenin's body in Moscow to come take care of the great leader, to preserve the great leader, right? So we already have these very Christian, profound ways, notions of the body, the transcendence of the body as political representation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is collapsing, right? So you've got all of these Soviets that are no longer Soviets, thinking, are we the capitalists of the North Koreans, the real Marxists now? And, it's also a murder mystery and a bunch of, and a comedy and a romance, fantastic novel. That said, I can't tell you who published it. You could probably spend some time on Substack and get Hyun Woo to send you the manuscript. But anyway, but I have edited it. Spent several weeks doing this, and I'm plugged for a book that hopefully will appear soon. So after still speaking about German socialism or European socialism, I did also have a sense that on the one hand, markets could be alienating, but on the other hand, at least in modern Germany, I think this has only gotten worse. There's not that much solidarity. Somewhat stultifying. Big companies, big unions, big banks, a high level of disconnect. And I think that's only gotten worse in the generation or so that has passed. But then I went off to law school, and it was the heyday of law and economics, which struck me as absolutely insane. So, 6 ways to Sunday, and I'm not going to. I'll let Daniel offer all the reasons. And that pretty much has been my career. What happens if we take the political and political economy seriously? What sort of polity are we trying to construct? And particularly, are we trying to construct through markets? What do we want to do with markets? How do we think of constructing these markets? And what do we want to do in some other ways, right? There's some things we don't want to do through markets. Your average litigation strikes me as one. So I wrote a bunch of books, and maybe 3 deserve mention here. The first was called City of Gold, an apology for global capitalism in a time of discontent. And that was an effort to justify and interrogate the European project and globalization more generally as a new political grammar, as a sort of response to the nationalism pretty much perfected by Nazi Germany. A response to the nation state at some level. Since then, the nation state has come roaring back, which raises further questions about the end of history and ends of political thought, but that would be a whole different talk. So let's move on from that. But the point for present purposes is I was looking at markets not because they generated wealth, but because they generated a certain kind of politics. And a kind of politics that my family had been very involved in. I spent some time at the commission and so forth, other stories. Second book, Out of Crisis, Rethinking Our Financial Markets. No, that's not the one. That's a different one. Was a response to the financial crisis. And the point for present purposes here, the point for present purposes is how might we think about markets if we no longer took efficiency terribly seriously as a concept? In other words, suppose we took Greenspan's The Entire Edifice Collapsed seriously and said, okay, the edifice collapsed, and that means all sorts of things, both for law and regulation, but also for the conceptualization of markets and maybe for the discipline of economics modeled on a notion of science. That unfortunately didn't really happen, sort of happened. So what do we want markets to do? So the big metaphors I used here were gardens and games. That is, we create spaces that foster certain kinds of competitive and cooperative behavior. Think of changing the rules of basketball, right? You add the 3-point line, you change the dynamic of the game. Looks different, right? You can have basketball without a 3-point line. You can have basketball with a 3-point line. You can move the 3-point line around and you'll get you will actually start recruiting different kinds of players with different skill sets, right? So it's not that there's some platonic, I hate the word, I use the word platonic, essential notion of basketball, or by extension, the market. There's how do we want basketball to play? How do we want the housing market to play? How do we want the education market to play? Good Lord, how do we want the healthcare market to play? Okay, so this is obviously political and not scientific. Reasonable minds may disagree. And I mean, there are increasing numbers of things in which I say, well, yeah, I've thought of that and I've thought of that, and I'm not sure what the hell I think. Right. Third book, Between Citizen and State, an introduction to the corporation. This book looked at what we teach in the Basic Business Associations course as a set of interlocked myths. And I don't mean myths in a derogatory sense. They're more or less true, but they're hardly consistent with one another. So the sort of mental furniture with which we approach corporate or just institutional life. So the question then, and the question I want to try to put some flesh on today is, what do we think is happening in society, history, that part of it? What should we be done? I'm not sure about either of these things. And how do we think about all of this? In other words, if we step back, philosophy is the ability to watch someone think. If we step back and ask, how am I conceptualizing the problems I'm trying to answer? So my basic intuition here, and I'm kind of going on to a somewhat reworked version of what you guys have in front of you. My basic thought here is that we're kind of prisoners of late 18th and 19th century thought. The way we think about political economy has, in some important ways, run their course. If we think about liberalism, now somewhat mysteriously called neoliberalism in certain quarters, the tradition runs back to Adam Smith. Paradigmatically, obviously, can go back. This is not a history course, not a history talk. But if we want to sort of signpost it, we say, Adam Smith. And the most influential critique or countervailing inclination is similarly traced back to Marx. And of course, Marx is hardly the only critical thinker. I personally would go back to Rousseau, et cetera, but dropping the footnotes. Those thinkers were operating in very different worlds, which doesn't mean that they're irrelevant. Aristotle's not irrelevant either. It does mean, though, that we read them differently and think about them differently. I don't think they can be deployed. I think they have to be thought through, and that's a different activity. So that by way of kind of preface. To state what I mean by social capitalism baldly, suppose we need healthy markets for human welfare, but we can't think about markets in this fashion. We can't think in terms of so-called liberal economics on the one hand, or communist, these days somewhat mysteriously called socialist, critiques of liberal economics on the other. And on the third hand, or maybe as a corollary, perhaps particularly relevant in the law school, what if the muddled solution favored by most academics, markets plus some redistribution of market outcomes, usually through a more or less interventionist state, what we might caricature as Denmark or Germany, doesn't really adequately capture things either? What if that's not adequate intellectually and maybe not adequate for reasons I'm only grappling with? I'm very concerned about Great Britain right now. What the hell is happening? Practically, socially, social psychologically. So I'm going to skip a bunch of footnotes. There's a paragraph here saying that I don't think this is an archival discussion. I'm not going to try to answer this by close reading Marx or Adam Smith or somebody else. Can, but I'm not going to. So what am I going to try to do? Well, if this kind of set of feelings is about right, I would expect to find it expressed in current issues. Kinds of issues that you might write a law review article about. And that has proven to be the case, right? Usually with my wife, Amy, because I'm no longer capable of writing a law review article, we've written some law review articles, and they're links. You can see them. So one such place is corporate governance, which Ron and Dan, you'll know at least as well as I do, can be argued over along really familiar lines. There's a long tradition going back into the late 19th century about, say, asking it. So there's a whole literature called theory of the firm, and the theory of the firm never gets resolved. Latest version of theory of the firm is, let's do a bunch of DEI stuff, or sometimes called corporate social responsibility. Or sometimes called ESG investing. So they're different little words, and the words change from time to time. And the notion here, basically, generally speaking, is companies owe political responsibility to society writ large, starting with their employees, but other folks too. These arguments have been around forever. Flip side of it is, usually called something like shareholder wealth maximization. Uh, Shareholders own the company. They invest in the company and make money. And that's what the real thing is about. This plays out along familiar political lines. It's after a certain number of decades, unbelievably uninteresting. I sounded more cynical than I meant it, so I'm sorry. So what to do with this? Well, in a recent piece, my wife and I argued that you can imagine a world in which both arguments. Okay, so from the left, by the way, this is easy, most easily seen from the left. From the left, the ESG stakeholder argument is generally presented as this is the good thing to do. And conversely, the person trying to maximize wealth, is in the position of the robber baron, blood-sucking capitalist pig, right? This is the old imagination in, present form. One hears a certain degree of this in contemporary politics in the metro area, I might say. Okay, so it's not entirely irrelevant. That said, one might also say, well, what if the investors are things like, I don't know, this university must have some endowment, right? Or a pension fund or a hospital.
$1 million. I just looked at it for my class.
Right. So you can imagine a world in which you're providing something that one would recognize as a social good through a claim on a fund. What are those funds invested in? So from this perspective is, what do we think we're doing with this set of institutions and this set of claims on the institutions? Question isn't what's efficient or natural. It's not economics as science, but profoundly political, as in political economy. What kind of market do we want here? Let's just say for large cap equities. Keep things simple. So the point of the little piece is, well, it kind of depends. That becomes a political discussion. And here we turn to demographics. The worker participation rate is just over half the population. That doesn't count children, nor does it count people who are institutionalized or in the military. We have sent lots of people chasing around after attempting to get a number of what percentage of Americans actually work. We can't quite figure it out. Call it half, right? And what percentage of Americans actually work enough to support themselves? Got to be less than half. Lots of people have shit jobs. Okay? So we have a lot of old people, right? We have a lot of people who can't take care of themselves. We have a lot of young people, even successful young people. I usually use my eldest son at this juncture. He did very well in school, went to law school. I couldn't stop him. Waste of a good philosopher. He's at Kirkland and Ellis, right? So let's say he, gets a job at 25, 26. He went straight through. I couldn't make him do anything more interesting than that either. He works to 65, lives to 95. Success story. He's worked half his life. Most of his life, he has been supported through some set of status, either through our household wealth, university endowments and the like, presumably saved wealth in his retirement. Making sense? So even in the success stories, you can't equate human welfare with the labor relationship. Right? We now have a fundamental problem with both Adam Smith and Marx's imagination of how political economy works. So if we care about people, we have to give them some claim upon the economic output of the nation. Now, we might not care about people, but, I'm sort of positing as a framing device of this talk that we care about people. So yeah, this is a talk for angels. In short, property. So if we start thinking about the core social relations in terms of property, that we're weaving the social fabric with status as opposed to contract, preeminently the labor contract that determines wages. We're basically turning Maine's famous definition of what it means to be modern, the movement from property to contract, on its head. I've said even my terribly successful son, who in fact negotiates contracts, right, will spend at least half of his life protected by and determined by property. In a world in which we think about politics, personal life, we use the word choice. We want to sound like liberal theorists. We use the word autonomy. We think that things that are progressive are movements towards autonomy. We've also now driven a truck through almost all contemporary legal scholarship. It's not about autonomy, or it's about autonomy in very limited circumstances, which sounds very Aristotelian, right? The gentleman enjoys autonomy, not the household. So the word neo-feudal gets thrown around as we're returning to status. And a lot of people feel it, although they usually feel it simply in terms of inequality. And what I'm talking about is inequality is a part of it, but by no means all of it. What do we want here? Now, I'm kind of resistant to this idea, right? I'm in this sense, given being brought up as an American of a certain age, I kind of believe in things like Republican, small r, democracy, small d, and that sort of thing. But I'm not sure it's describing the world that we're living in now. So when I look at the hijinks of Elon Musk or something like that, colonizing the world's space, I'm not sure what Madison has to do with it. I'm giving you sound bites. And so that's it's not fun. It's not. I mean, it's, one of the things my Substack agonizes about is this, right? It's and I think one thing that a lot of the people I talk with, some of my speakers in this program I'm running, people have the sense of kind of the world is being pulled out from under them, and some of that is simply the president, but some of it seems to be running deeper. And it's also not just this country. There are other places to start. So anyway, if it's our fate, then I suppose the political theoretical task for people like me, should you choose to accept this mission? And one of my questions is maybe not, maybe I'm going to dinner, is how do we think about a world in which that kind of political grammar, which I would trace back to Hobbes and the end of the Middle Ages and so forth, is it really working for us? In other words, if we need to be, we're not talking about class and status as aberrations from a Republican social order. We'd have to start talking about them as the order in which we live, and then starting to critique it on that basis or understand it on that basis. If we're living in Venice, what do we expect from the Doge? Other places to start. That's kind of the theory way. I always tend to start with theory. It's probably bad. I'm currently teaching UB's New York City program in business and law. And it's increasingly about funds, banks and funds, different kinds of banks, in different kinds of lenders, investing in alternative spaces. It's not only a matter of capital compounding, the rich getting richer, which it is. It's that the social in the United States, as I've already suggested, can be understood largely as a web of funds. We deliver health care, almost 20% of the economy, through insurance companies and a host of endowed institutions. Similar things can be said about education and retirement and culture more generally. So the social is profoundly capitalistic. The situation in Europe is somewhat different, but different in its mechanisms rather than fundamental capital H history dynamics. If anything, most European countries have similar or worse demographics, for starters. So the question remains how to secure human well-being if we don't believe many of the humans can take care of themselves. To generalize, in Europe, more social services are provided more directly by government. That said, as the current US administration has made clear, government supplies money from somewhere, raising lots of questions about sovereign debt. Europeans have a little bit of issues with that. And taxation, more issues. Taxation of what? That is, how does the society foster the kind of economic activity that will sustain the society, even if much of the society doesn't work? And here Europeans are very, very concerned about things like lack of startups. I've got a lot to say about, this is just another bullet point when we go on about Europe and so forth, but let's not. I have an enormous amount to say about AI. Meaning generative AI, not the older tradition of symbolic AI, as I was talking to Ron about. And much of my attention is in this space at present. I don't really want to talk about AI at the moment. I mean, I don't. But I will say that most of the computer science folks, NSA DARPA types, with whom I speak are flummoxed by the scale of investment. And they tend to believe a crash of some sort is inevitable. And I will add only that it's difficult to imagine the recovery of much of this investment without exacerbating the dynamics, essentially automation and unemployment, that I think make social capitalism imperative, or might make social capitalism imperative.
Do you want maybe 4 or 5 minutes and then we'll open it up?
Sure, I can stop now. I mean, just, yeah. Okay, let's skip some stuff. I'll skip a bunch of stuff about market structure. You guys, if you guys have a hand, I can sort of see that. So, but where does all this add up to? I guess one thing I would say is I don't think this is a matter of left or right. In fact, left or right, as you probably know, come from the French Revolution. I don't think it's a useful way to begin thinking about this. So perhaps the first task, or at least the only task I'd be any good at, is theoretical. You know, how can we start thinking about this sort of stuff? And if we do, the lawyer inevitably asks, what would it look like on the ground? What would be different about it on the ground? Or if I just, once again, reinvented European social democracy. You can wander around and wander around and wander around and come back to European social democracy. I don't think so. So let me, how would it be different and sort of how can we think about it? Well, one thing we might think about is we might just go ahead and think more about property, sort of up front. It's hard to keep track of in the news world, but Trump, sort of announced this, we're going to give every baby a little bit of money. I guess a big chunk of what I'm saying is kind of like an expansion of that. Maybe that's a good idea. This would be something, an extension of two very American ideas, which most of you probably participate in. One is tax advantage retirement funding. Right. So, we work hard with the tax system to make you all safe for entire retirement, 401ks, IRAs, that sort of thing. So what are we doing here? Right. When we move from defined benefit to defined contribution retirement, we basically incentivize, as I used to tell my students, if we are at all successful in getting you a job, you will be capital, not labor. Or you're going to end up under a bridge. We don't like people under bridges. It's bad. So that's a thought. You can say similar things about home ownership, right? Lots of policies in America, lots of institutions in America are focused on the sort of Jeffersonian notion of America works better when we have stakes in America. If we're going to do this on a political standpoint, let's make every America have stakes in America. Which is something different than every American have a good job. because I don't believe you can hold a good job for as long as you're going to live. So that's one sort of set of thoughts. Another set of thoughts is something I've been thinking about, never written about. I don't know why we don't have more not-for-profits for sort of other than non-charitable institutions. Excuse me, for non-charitable institutions, right? Right. So basically, not-for-profits have to have some sort of charitable purpose. Goes back to what is the Statute of Benefits or something like that, and Queen Elizabeth. Statute. Thank you. But suppose you have something. This is maybe in some tension with the other. Suppose you really think you need return on capital, and you need to innovate. Right? And maybe you need to take over your neighboring company or something. Suppose you just want stuff to be there and kind of work okay, like a dairy. Maybe you would like to have local milk. Right. Would that be a more interesting world in which we had like a lot of relatively small businesses that were paying the people who work there, but didn't necessarily return a lot on capital and kind of competed accordingly? You might want that kind of thing for like old folks' homes, right? There's sort of an issue right now with old folks' homes where we really might care about stakeholders more than we were to care about return on capital. But right now, what we've got is a lot of private equity groups moving into old folks' homes, and that creates tension. Right? Much friendlier sense of regulation. Basically, in the United States, particularly around tech, we have this notion of you can do it until it hurts somebody, and that hurt is enough to generate political or legal opposition. So now we have Elon Musk running communications for the war in Ukraine. Who the hell idea was that? That is just not a way to run a military policy. It's insane. We appear to have 7 of the largest companies in the country convinced that if they don't win the AI war, they will be bankrupt. I see no way they can all win. I just don't think it can happen. Which means that we're probably looking at, maybe not, maybe there's a way out of the balloon I haven't seen yet. Maybe if the financing is circular enough, we can basically run this as a balance sheet operation. But it's hard to see. So one thing you might say is you might start regulating a lot of things in a way more akin to how we think about bank risk, with the introduction of technology, with the assumption of huge amounts of leverage, that sort of thing. That would not be small L liberal, right? We're not relying on the market to sort of say, this is the structure we want for these markets. This is saying it is an oligopoly. What do we want from the tech lords? Final thought I had in the car here. I would think a lot about redistribution of equity stakes. Company gets to, I don't know, I'm just pick a number, $500 billion valuation. You put $100 billion into a fund. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
I think that's number Okay. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank Professor Westbrook for coming and joining us today, trekking out to Hempstead. I've long been an admirer of his work. His book that he mentioned, Between Citizen and State, is actually required reading for my corporate law seminar class.
Really?
Yes, I find it both very clear and also very insightful. It covers the basics, but then it actually goes into, as you could tell, depth and insight. So now when Norm asked me to prepare a response today, I was terrified. I think maybe you might understand why. I've read a lot of Bert's material, a lot of his work, and I actually do understand some of it. So let me just stay up front. It's not a reflection of him. It's a reflection of me. I'm a little bit out of my depth, okay? I mean, I know law a bit. I know economics a bit. I know law and economics a bit. But this goes well beyond any of that, drawing in part upon traditions that I have very little familiarity with. So I'm going to do my best to rise to the occasion, and I hope you'll forgive me. To Professor Westbrook's chagrin, I fear, and I think I told this to you once, and I think you might have shuddered virtually. I have likened him to Notre Dame's Patrick Deneen. Yeah, he's shuddering. But like Deneen, I think he escapes the typical confines of right and left. He actually mentioned that in his talk today, not more regulation versus less regulation versus smart regulation. But there's a sense that all of this is, to use a hackneyed term, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. There's a sense that there is a really deep problem in our system that goes beyond not just the free market system, but perhaps even the entire Enlightenment project as a whole. And of course, this comes from a long, veritable tradition, right? I think also of greats like Robert Putnam and Alasdair MacIntyre, both who said that there's a certain societal disintegration that's going on. Like, has this whole Enlightenment project run its course?
McIntyre was big in
Yeah,
not Putnam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I got 50%. I'll bet 500.
No. I think the Putnam reference is fine. But I will just say, just biographically, McIntyre was big.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's reflected, I think. I do think there's a reason that there's an uptick in interest in ancient Rome, and especially its fall nowadays. I mean, we're coming up on 250 years old. Their republic lasted 500 years, and it ended too. There's a sense of crisis, I think, that's going on. And I think Bert is actually addressing that. So substantively, what can I say? So I'm going to react to two or three things in particular that you said today. I do think you're onto something when you say that property is important. The whole skin in the game phenomenon, I think, is essential to a way out of perhaps this mess. I was looking at some statistics. In the 1980s, and this is just a proxy for other things, but in the 1980s, something like, I think 20% of Americans paid federal income tax. 20% did not, illegally, did not pay federal income tax. And I think in the 90s, 24%. By 2000, you're pushing at 40. COVID changed everything. But then today, I think it's up to about 45% of Americans pay no federal income tax. Now, if you have a society where basically half of the population is voting for policies to spend other people's money. Now, of course, there's property issues and all other, but I think that's just problematic. And so I think to give everyone skin in the game is helpful. That's why I think in corporate governance literature, there is a push to have employee stock options, right? Have the workers, share in the benefit of the company. If the company profits, they profit. If the company doesn't profit, they suffer. So I do think that I think that's an area to explore. You also mentioned not-for-profits that do work that's not purely charitable. I do think that there's a movement afoot here, right? The benefit corporation phenomenon, which of course you're familiar with, hasn't exactly taken off, but even Delaware does now have a benefit corporation statute. And that allows, for those of you who aren't as familiar with this stuff, the typical corporation is operated to maximize profits for the shareholders. They can get away with not doing it, but that's the paper manifestation. That's the paper sort of principle. The benefit corporation can balance profit maximization with other social concerns. So it is a lot like you're saying. It could be run with an eye towards sort of charitable issues, charitable interests, not charitable, just non-profit maximizing interests. For my own part, and I'll just throw this into the loop because I have the floor for another 30, 40 seconds or so. Here's what I struggle with regard to markets. And you didn't touch on this so much, and you may disagree, may think this is bunk. But for my part, I think for markets to work properly, they have to be, and when I say work properly, let me define the term, to generate wealth in a way that's not socially destructive, right? So for my part, I believe that for markets to work properly, they must be situated in a healthy cultural setting. You need to have certain societal guardrails in place. And what keeps me up at night, and again, is that I fear that markets have a tendency to cannibalize the very things they need to operate well. And I feel like
for sure.
Well, that's okay.
I just didn't say that.
Okay.
No, but it's clearly right.
And that's bad because I think we're now at that point where we've cannibalized almost all of it, right? Like virtue, trust, certain things that are just necessary for the the healthy operational market. We're running on we're exhausting what's left from 200-300 years ago. And when it runs out, if it hasn't already, I think we're in trouble. So, how do you fix that? I don't know. So anyway, so those are my, apologies for sharing such bleak thoughts with you. But on the bright side, we have David thinking about this. So thank you very much. And no need to respond. Thank you.
So while Daniel speaks, I will take a cue if those of you who would like to ask questions.
So, Bert, you're struggling with the big questions that I long ago decided are beyond my grasp.
We started.
So don't write the book. We're done.
No, they're beyond my grasp. It doesn't mean they're beyond yours, but they are beyond mine. But I do think it's totally clear to anybody who's paying attention that something has changed in our politics and our economics that neither Smith nor Marx gives us tools to understand. And I take it that's your intro point, your point of intro, and it seems completely correct. And so to bring this to a slightly more simplistic level than you have, there are a couple of points that I'm seeing here. One is the collapse of the public-private distinction, which we've talked about since about 1940 in the law, but it's much more general. It underpins so much of not just our legal system, but 19th century thought.
Yes,
Generally,
yes.
right? And
The whole problem of regulation assumes that, and then we bridge it when with the private people are beating up on each other and it's negative externality. So then we allow the reach in. And I think all of that's inadequate.
Right. It just doesn't, right. The markets, the core of the private sector, right, require a deep public background, not just the reliance on stable rights of contract and trade and property law and the other things that are being attacked by our government at the moment. But
the result of that.
Also the regulation that is necessary to limit the inevitable tendency of contract law to redistribute wealth upwards.
Yeah.
The law that we need to prevent office holders, both public and corporate, private in general, nonprofits as well, and the institutions that they control from using their positions for personal purposes instead of public purposes, right? Which has become a serious problem. But these are not new issues. I think Aristotle talks about them. They've been around for a long time. Certainly, it's in Leviticus at quite some length. So these are problems that have been around for a while. And conversely, it's not the other side is, as we've seen in repeated panic since the turn of the century, the basic private market notion that private profit also requires the possibility of private losses.
Yep.
Doesn't apply because the private losses are public.
Yep.
Right? Because the system collapses, right? And so the pinnacles of the economy, both the large institutions and the wealthy families, are at this point beyond responsibility. That's the end of the private sector. No responsibility, no private sector. Decades ago, a real estate developer famously said taxation is for the little people. And we've heard a more recent version of it a couple of presidential elections ago. That's the principle of the pre-revolutionary Ancien Regime, and it's the principle of the Soviet Union's nomenclatura, and it's now seems to be our own principle, not only about taxes, but the upper class expects and receives bailouts when their bets fail. They expect and they receive immunity from the injuries that they inflict on others. And the law, in 1,000 ways, creates inequality and defies the allegedly fundamental capitalist notion of pricing based on cost.
Right.
And meanwhile, so that's the private sector, but meanwhile, the publicness of the public sector, which was always somewhat limited, is basically in collapse as the wealth at the top has gotten way beyond the point at which Republican theorists used to, since Machiavelli, I think, said is the end of the republic, right? The law can't survive when some men control so much wealth that they can buy loyalty. And we clearly have, the theory is not new, but the reality is, I think, changed, at least for us.
Yeah.
So that's the public-private distinction.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think you're talking about throughout the various aspects of your little talk here and your work generally is the financialization of the economy, which basically has meant that the distinction between capital and labor has, I'm not sure if I would go as far as you say collapsed, but it at least has radically changed. Half of us are indirect shareholders, half of us are homeowners, therefore aristocrats of a sort, right? And only about half of us are workers. So and most of us, that's three halves, right? So most of us are in
Yeah.
both these roles most of the time, right?
Right.
Actually, the whole half that are shareholders are also
Right.
right? It's all the same.
But insofar as the guy under the bridge needs an emergency room, that hospital needs an endowment.
And here's the other piece that I didn't hear today, but I think I've seen in your work before. While we are half labor, half capital, not functioning in the class system that Marx talks about in particular, right? Nearly all of us belong to the precariat. We're all a little bit of bad luck away from being under the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And the economy doesn't respond to us as consumers, as laborers, or as capitalists. We have no control in any of those. So the shareholder democracy is a myth. Consumer sovereignty is a myth. Labor power doesn't exist. There isn't even a myth about it. In the modern corporation, whether it's for profit or not for profit, we are all treated as inputs to be minimized in the service of a goal. But it's not even clear what the goal is. It's certainly not shareholder profit maximization, because the shares are also an input to be minimized. Maybe it's institutional survival or elite self-aggrandizement, or maybe there's a bit of Marx that you should go back to and treat a little more seriously from Louis Bonaparte, and talk about institutions that have escaped human control and are now out there in a form of idolatry governing us. So
That's a good point.
So where do we go from here? We have that, I think, is the question that I hope you do address in the book, and I hope you do write it. We have an economy in which investment depends on Wall Street fads. That's your AI point, right? Rather than on customers. He's figured out a way to make money off of the AI, and yet it is driving the economy at this point. It's hard to see it left of consumer sovereignty there. When profits depend on financial manipulation rather than production, Marx's analysis should lead us to total despair. The proletariat, even our intellectual work, no longer has a function. And so far from being the inevitable ruling class, we're just obsolete. And by we, I think I mean all of us. But the old issues haven't gone away.
Yep.
The blood of our siblings still cries out from the ground, demanding justice. The strangers and friends in our midst still demand care and not oppression. Most people still need meaningful work, and not too many of us have it. And everyone needs money to function in markets, which, distorted as they are, still decide that we're going to have TikTok and we're going to have iPhones, but we're not going to have public transit, and we're not going to have walking cities. And it's the markets that tell us whether we're going to have vegetables available for dinner. To my mind, we need to find a way to save philosophy itself from the forces that would replace it entirely with rhetoric, branded as communication, at least in this university.
Ouch.
But to understand the financialization of the economy, I think it's not so much Smith and Marx, it's Keynes that we need to take more seriously. We need to think about the impact of AI. We need to wonder who produces it, who owns it, who controls it, and with what goals, and who's going to be responsible for its mistakes and the hatred and the invasion of the basic decencies of life that we're seeing. So I'm left asking, do we have or need a new philosophy? Or is it enough to struggle to change the world that we see?
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll open it up to some more questions before you reply, or do you want to reply now and hear the questions after?
Whatever you want to do. I don't care.
Well, I think it's good to sort of put the other ideas on the table and then give you an opportunity to sort of sort through them.
Sure.
I have Ian, Jack, Scott, and do I have anybody on Zoom, and Alex? Anybody else on Zoom that I've missed, and Barbara? Okay, Ian.
Hi.
Hi.
I really enjoyed that. And your car thought is something I've been thinking about a lot, about reinvesting into the companies. And I wanted to ask if there's a model for it in which I don't really understand why, if a corporation makes a lot of money, why all of that goes to the shareholders. Like, is there a model in which Europeans or someone else say, okay, well, a certain amount of it has to be redistributed to the workers themselves? And like, is that a form of social capitalism, in which they say, well, your profit, your percentage of your profits is have to always be reinvested into the company and to the workers? And if that would be an effective tool to raise rising tide, get people more wealthy.
Jack.
Yeah. Thank you. This was really great. So I worry I might just be restating your very question back at you, but here's maybe how I was thinking about your question. And so, there's the where do we want to go, which is like, we're doing Denmark, Germany, UBI, the policy prescriptions. Then there's the how do we get there, which is a question of politics and persuasion, presumably based on why we want to go there, like what the reasons, maybe not. So that's my question. What type of persuasion do we need to do? And is it, and I take from your writing and from your talk today that it's not going to be a philosophical attack on your definition of private is wrong and incoherent and mine is right. It's not going to be logical or even however coherent, however correct that may be. It's going to be something else that is.
Speaking of the end of philosophy.
Yeah. Well,
I'm clearly out of a job. That's the point.
I crossed out materialism. You said you didn't like it.
Yeah.
I wrote in practical. When you suggested that, which is, what's the alternative kind of argument? And is it something like projecting the misery that we are all about to face when, either markets don't need us, they don't need our labor.
We're already there.
They still need our consumption now, which is why UBI is a thing.
Yes.
Right. So
Less and less.
less and less. But, is that the only type of persuasive argument we can make is look where this is going? And it's going to mean, Elon flying off in his spaceship with his self-regulating farm and all of us just stuck on a earth without anything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a limit to how many of these questions I can remember.
Three, and then we'll go on to the next three.
Okay, so
And these two.
a couple of things. One is lawyers love prescriptions and love normative thought, which is fine, but not necessarily what I do. So one of the things to say, I think somebody mentioned employee ownership of firms. Right, Ron did, right? So that's a kind of a nice idea. I like it, right? You give people stake in their enterprise, right? It's like making them a partner of something, right? I think it's a great idea. But there's an obvious huge downside, right? Which we saw in a big way in the Enron collapse, right? And that is you've totally undiversified your employees up to the C-suite, right? Because their number one asset is their job. And their number two asset is the payment they got through their job in equity in the company, right? So there's a problem. That doesn't mean necessarily you shouldn't do it, right? That means that these are going to be discussions, right? You don't really want, a young mother of two to be all in on a company that turns out to be Enron, right? Which happened, right? For thousands of people, right? So you're going to get. You're going to get ordinary politics with ordinary trade-offs. It is not a silver bullet-y type situation here. To the thought on labor, the first and largest point is traditionally, we've relied on a labor market to shortage of labor means wages go up. That creates its own problems. That creates the dynamic of inflation, among other things, which creates other problems for people, the same people considered as consumers, and more to the point, people on fixed incomes do not enjoy the benefit of the wage increase. So we're back to Keynes, right? These are not new problems, right? Finding the balance that is right under certain circumstances in a certain time and place is a hard question. I would think a flat return X as wages is probably a mistake for all sorts of reasons having to do with how you manage the investment of the company, right? But my more fundamental point is you're still just talking about workers, right? So, I mean, I think one of the fundamental, using anthropology words, sort of the imaginary here is that if you care about people, you care about labor. That's just no longer statistically the case. Never was, but it was tenable, at least as a matter of rhetoric, for a good long run. Call it 200 years, give or take.
Because they didn't care about children and women.
They didn't care about children and women, and people didn't live as long.
There were no retirees.
And there were no retirees, right? So insofar as we're talking about our better natures, we're talking about a degree of caritas, altruism, whatever you want to say. I don't have any problem with saying we should raise a wage or something like that. Again, it's not free, right? There will be problems with that. So you return to ordinary politics in that sense. To Daniel's point, or several points, there is always a danger if you frame something as a narrative. And the vast majority of social criticism since Ruskin, this is the 19th century or so, has been framed, maybe Adam Smith himself, and certainly Marx too, as things were this way and now they're this way, right? There's a process of historical change, and then some argument is made on the basis of that change. And this is almost reflexive. It's some giant percentage of journalism, which sails under the banner of news, right? So we tend to understand things in a kind of loosey-goosey historical fashion. And we tend to make philosophical arguments, especially since Nietzsche, in this sort of historical modality. To which it is there are two structural arguments that are always available. One is you didn't get the details right. That's what what the historian says to the philosopher every time. And the other one that sometimes other philosophers say and sometimes historians says is some version of, yeah, Aristotle knew that too, or Leviticus, right? And those answers are always sort of true, right? Greed is not new. Corruption is not new. The public-private distinction changes for every culture, but it's muddying, and it's not, by the way, noble in and of itself, right? And it muddies over time. At that level, the human condition is the human condition. And I hate to say this, but somewhat transhistorical, right? So the harder question becomes, right about all this stuff at some level of abstraction, right? But if we drill down a little bit, how right? So let me say just a teeny bit about, yesterday in the program I teach, I had a senior Washington lawyer in his 70s. He'd spent a lot of time kind of a lobbyist, working both sides of the aisle, that sort of thing, right? And he's talking about Congress. And I'm just like, and one of the kids was the grandchild of a congressman who he had a contact with, like in the 80s, Small Business Administration, stuff like that. And I'm just like being blown away. I said, it really was a different world, right? Washington, when I was there, in the 80s, 90s, mentioned Clinton balancing the budget, that sort of thing, right? This is a different planet. And so, when you kind of come down to that level, so this is going to bring me back to Ron's point. I do think that there are things that do change in ways that are significant and that we can't simply say there's nothing new under the sun. Somebody said about the wasp ascendancy, you'll miss it when it's gone. Right. Right. If you really have a lack of certain cultural understandings, coming back to Ron, about what you do and don't do in politics, right, that changes things. And that acts really, really, it's much, much easier to be a social critic than it is, or a social tragedian than it is to be a social comedian. In the sense of how do we make new things? How do we sort of erect cultural standards that are fairly durable? I mean, virtues also come from someplace, but it's much easier from an analytic standpoint to see them being eroded. So I think those are the kinds of challenges. And here I'll stop and we can take more questions. One of the things I try to tell my students, I say, it's like, you guys come to law school, you're used to arguments. You're used to zero-sum arguments. They're highly structured. They tend to be logical. You tend to kind of want to win. And I said, that's cool. America, civil rights tradition, certainly the tradition of legal education going back farther than Langdell. Footnote. Right? That doesn't build cities. That doesn't get your grandmother her pension. Right? So how do you get people into a room? So one of the things we did was we had the mayor of New Rochelle. She's trying to build new housing. She gets a bunch of people in the room. Who's going to rent the stuff? Who's going to build the stuff? What can the city do to help? Who's going to do finance? How do you keep everybody in the room? And that, that's how we get things done collectively. And we're not very good in the law school for historical reasons of our own, thinking that way. But like I say, in this program, one of the things is people come in and they say, how do we get a deal done? And that's not an argument you win. It's an argument everybody gets comfortable. And then we start talking a lot about trust, coming back to virtue. I say, you guys are supposed to be kind of smart, but I'm not asking you to be Mozart. I wanted to be Mozart. I left the firm, right? But I say, but they have to want to work with you. You have to be a mensch, right? And I had to teach them the word mensch. But anyway, but you see what I'm saying? And they're getting it, right? But this is highly social. It's quasi-rational. And on good days, it's constructive.